Okay, hi everyone. This is Unit 7 of Neuroscience for Non-Majors, and it's the kind of combination science fiction and computational neuroscience unit. So I'll share my screen. Okay, so in this unit, we're going to learn about labeled line codes, uncertainty, entropy, and mutual information, Gaussian probability distributions, Bayes' theorem, the Wilson Cowan model, phase planes and nullclines, as well as neural networks and deep learning. So the first thing we're going to talk about is our labeled line codes. So basically, the brain takes into account the inputs it receives, the firing rates of those, the firing rates that result from those inputs, the context it is in, and prior knowledge to formulate a guess or a perception of what is in the external world. And so if we know the receptive fields of different neurons, all we would need to do to figure out what is in the world is kind of look at which neurons are firing and how they're firing. And these descriptions are called labeled line codes. A type of labeled line code called a rate code looks at the frequency or speed, kind of the rate at which the neurons are firing. Which is helpful to distinguish between two neurons that have different firing rates but respond to similar stimuli, for example, like the place cells we learned about. Timing codes, on the other hand, can distinguish between situations in which the same neuron fires the same number of spikes, but differently over a given interval of time. For the time codes to do this, we can kind of divide that interval of time into different like time bins. For example, taking a 10-second interval and dividing it into sub-intervals of, sub-intervals or time bins of 1 second each. And then within that 10-second interval, we can see which time bin each spike is located in. If either a situation A or situation B, a single neuron would fire like 3 spikes in the same 10-second interval, we can then distinguish between the two situations by seeing that during A, it fired spikes at seconds 1, 4, and 7, while in situation B, it fired spikes at seconds 2, 4, and 9 in the time interval. And then we can kind of rewrite these time intervals into like words, in a sense, that the neuron speaks using ones and zeros to digitize them. So like 1 will mean that yes, the neuron spiked in a time bin, and 0 will mean no, it did not spike in a time bin. So if we have our established interval of 10 seconds, in situation A, the neuron fired at seconds 1, 4, and 7, so its word will be this, where it has 1s in those places where it spiked and 0s in all the other places. In situation B, the neuron fired at seconds 2, 4, and 9 in the interval, so its word will be this, where 2, 4, and the second, fourth, and ninth place have 1s, and the rest of them have 0s. If we see a word then where the 1s and 0s are located generally in the same time bins as situation A's word, we can then know that situation A has probably occurred, and similarly for situation B. So if we don't know what a situation is, we can look at the firing pattern of the neuron and see what word it is saying and deduce what the situation is from that word. We can also use a computer to figure things out about the external world based on recordings from a neuron. So for example, if there's like a visual stimulus that moves up or down, and we know that there's a neuron that only fires if the stimulus moves down, then we can ask a computer to tell us kind of how the visual stimulus is moving based on the firing pattern of that neuron. So we can compare rate and timing-based classifiers by feeding each one 2 numbers. So in the rate-based classifiers case, we will give it the number of spikes in neuron A that fires more during situation A, and the number of spikes in neuron B, in a neuron B that fires more during situation B. And when doing this in a computer, we find, and then for the timing-based classifier also, I'll give it the timing of only the first spike of neuron A and only the first spike of neuron B to kind of like even the field a little bit, because obviously if we were given the timing of all of the spikes, it would automatically do better. So we're only giving it the first spike to see how it compares with the rate-based classifier. So when doing this in a computer, we find that the timing-based classifiers are far more accurate, even if they're only looking at the latency or the delay of start time of the first spike. And in experiments that recorded activity in retinas in response to visual stimuli of various difficulty levels, biological systems perform better than the rate-based classifier, which kind of suggests that animals use timing to decode neural activity patterns in addition to rate. However, it doesn't always, biological systems don't always use the timing-based classifiers. For example, in somatosensation experiments conducted in monkeys and leeches, we find that biological systems actually use the rate-based classifiers more so than timing-based ones. And it's also kind of like an indication of how, you know, biology doesn't always like want or need the most accurate system. And, you know, in some cases, the most accurate system might even like work against the functioning of the entire organism or whatever. And also like keep in mind that evolution just perpetuates systems that work and not systems that are the most accurate. And yeah, so, all right, now we can move on to mutual, okay, yeah. So, okay. The way that we process the outside world in our brains can kind of be thought of as in terms of all of the stimuli, or like everything in the external world being acknowledged by sensors, which use a function that causes a pattern of responses in sensory brain areas. So mutual information represents how correlated neurons are to the outside world and how little uncertainty there is about the external world. And this uncertainty about information can actually be expressed in terms of entropy because of a really beautiful mathematical analogy and relationship between thermodynamics and information theory that I won't get into in this lecture, but you can definitely ask me to go over if you're interested in it. But basically, we can use the following formula here to find the entropy or uncertainty S of an object, which can take n possible states. And yeah, but also this formula is taking the negative of the sum of kind of each set of probability of a state happening times the natural log of the probability of that state happening. But since it's also easy to convert like logs between bases, we can use base 2 instead of the natural log, and I'll explain why in a moment. But so our formula will actually look like this though, over here. So log base 2 can be used to describe the bits or the number of kind of yes or no questions needed to figure out what state our object is in. So like, for example, if we have a set of boxes and a coin is placed in one of those boxes, then we can ask yes or no questions to figure out which box the coin is placed in. So if there is one box it would take kind of 0 questions to know if the coin is in the box or not. 2 boxes would take 1 question. 4 boxes would take 2 questions. 8 boxes then would take 3 questions, and so on. So the number of boxes is kind of equal to 2 to the power number of questions, but it's easier to write it as kind of log base 2 of the number of boxes kind of equals the number of questions. But this, keep in mind, is only true if all of the boxes have an equal probability of containing the coin. And this equal probability version is actually a simplification of the previous formula describing the entropy. In the case of equal probability, using properties of logarithms, you can convert between the two. But the entropy formula can also be used to determine the bits for unequal probabilities as well. Like, say there is a card with a 25% chance of having A written on it, a 15% chance of having B written on it, a 10% chance of having C written on it, and a 50% chance of having D written on it. So these are the probabilities. We can find the uncertainty of the situation by plugging into the formula from before. And we find that this situation contains 1.74 bits of uncertainty. And also note that there's actually less uncertainty here with unequal probabilities than there would be if all of the probabilities were equal. Okay, so mutual information is basically the amount by which uncertainty is reduced, and how much uncertainty has been reduced is equivalent to how much we have learned about a situation and how much information we have gained about a situation. So if there is a coin in one of 5 boxes, and if the probability of the coin being in each box is equal, we can calculate using the formulas described before that the uncertainty of the situation is 2.32 bits. But then if we, narrow down the choices to 2 boxes instead of 5, we could then calculate the uncertainty of this new situation, which has 2 options of equal probability, and find that it is 1 bit. So then the mutual information is described by the formula prior uncertainty minus residual uncertainty. And in this case, the prior uncertainty would be the 2.32 bits, and the residual uncertainty would be the 1 bit. So the mutual information, or the information that we have gained from the situation, is 2.32 bits minus 1 bit, which is 1.32 bits of information that we have learned. Okay, now say there are 3 neurons, neuron X, neuron Y, and neuron Z, which each have their own receptive fields. X responds to a light touch on the right index finger, Y responds to pain in the right index finger, and Z responds to light touch in the right middle finger. So as we have learned in previous classes, X, Y, and Z will all eventually, through intermediary neurons, give inputs to the left somatosensory cortex. So when the brain receives neurotransmitter that was released because neuron X sent a signal, then the brain interprets that as the light touch on the right index finger. So if we know that the touch is coming from either the right index finger or the right middle finger, then we can calculate the uncertainty of the situation, which has 2 equally likely possibilities, like just which finger it's coming from. And we see with the formula, it's just 1 bit of uncertainty. So if the brain knows that neuron X is firing, then it also knows the right index finger has been touched. If it knows neuron X is not firing, then the middle finger must be touched, since that's the only other option in this problem. But either way, our brain only needs to know about one of the neurons to figure out which finger is being touched. It's the same as like the box situation. So, but Now, to complicate things though, rather than only firing or not firing, say neuron X fires more or less depending on whether it is being touched, but always fires at some frequency measured in hertz. So when it is not touched, then the probability of it firing 1 hertz is going to be 0.25. The probability of it firing 2 hertz is going to be 0.5. The probability of it firing 3 hertz is going to be 0.25. And the probability of it firing 4 hertz is 0. But if it is being touched, then the probabilities change. The probability of it firing 1 hertz is now 0. The probability of it firing 2 hertz is now 0.25. 3 hertz is 0.5. And 4 hertz is 0.25. So through this, we know that if neuron X fires at 4 hertz, since there's a 0% chance of it firing 4 hertz when the index finger is not being touched, then we know that the finger must have been touched. But if it fires at 2 hertz, it's a little bit more interesting because then it is more likely that the finger has not been touched, but it's not as, clear. So we can describe this scenario of the probability of a situation A happening given a situation B using something called Bayes' theorem. So here, what this basically is saying is that the probability of a situation A happening given, this symbol means kind of given, a situation B is equal to the probability of the situation B happening given situation A times the probability of situation A happening at all over the probability of situation B happening at all. Yeah, so if neuron X is definitely firing at 2 hertz and there's a 0.5 probability of X firing in the first place, all we need to know is the probability of X firing 2 hertz at all, and then one can apply Bayes' theorem to find the probability of the finger being touched. And also, we need to know the formula for the probability of situation B happening at all is given down here. Now, in our neurons and finger touch situation, situation A is actually going to be the probability of the finger being touched, and situation B is going to be the neuron firing 2 hertz. So the probability, we're trying to find the probability that the finger is touched given that neuron X is firing 2 hertz. So this, if we look back at our probability chart, we find that the probability of the situation, we find that the probability of it being firing 2 hertz when it's touched is 0.25, and the probability of it being touched at all is 0.5. So over here, when we're trying to find over here, that probability of it firing 2 hertz when it's touched, multiply the probability of it being touched at all is going to be 0.25 times 0.5. And then we plug into this formula the probability that situation B, which is it firing 2 hertz, is going to happen given situation A, multiplied by the probability of situation A happening at all. And we add that to the probability of situation B happening, given that the situation A is not happening at all, and again, situation B is it firing 2 hertz. So here, this is the probability of it firing 2 hertz if it's not being touched, multiplied by the probability that it's not being touched, which is 0.5. And so from that, we get 0.375 as the probability of the neuron just firing 2 hertz in general. and we divide it by that. So we have our numerator and our denominator, and we find that there's a 33% chance of the finger being touched if neuron X is firing 2 Hz. Okay, so Bayes' theorem is actually incredibly important for beginning to understand how to computationally model things like the creation of an expectation in the brain given some prior knowledge and some current sensory data. So to be able to, I guess, use this data, we have to use probability distributions rather than just straight values. And we get these from like actual functions, and which need to, since they're probabilities, all add up to 1, this entire distribution of probabilities. So one of the most common types of distributions is called a Gaussian distribution, which has this equation over here as a function of the data points x. The mean is mu, and it's kind of what sets the center of this distribution and where the center of the distribution will be. And then while the actual like spread of the distribution is going to be determined by a term sigma squared, which is basically you take the square of the standard deviation of how far away the values are from the mean, and this squared standard deviation term is called the variance. Okay. Well, in Bayes' theorem, we're now going to use distributions of probabilities instead of just the straight probability values, and we'll also give names to these different distributions. So we can actually use this to get a computer to, so yeah, this is the example that I used is basically it's trying to get a, it's not, this orientation of stimulus in terms of degrees is not always going to be the x-axis of a Gaussian distribution. It's going to be whatever the situation kind of calls for, or whatever you're like measuring, or whatever you're, yeah. This is just for an example situation that we're going to use, where basically a computer kind of can combine information to locate a sound's origin based on auditory and visual cues. Yeah, and it gives you the like orientation of where that sound is coming from. Okay, so the names and everything now. So to find the most likely hypothesis for something, Bayes' theorem takes something called a prior probability distribution, and it's really based on kind of already built expectations of, in this case, like prior visual expectations of where something might be located in your surroundings based on visual data. And it multiplies this prior probability distribution of where the thing might be located based on the current situation sensory data. In this case, the new auditory information coming in, the new auditory information coming in from the surroundings. And that is called the likelihood probability distribution. And all of these are functions that use this Gaussian distribution, by the way. All of these are using that function to get this distribution of probabilities. And then it multiplies the likelihood and the prior together and divides it by something called a normalizing constant, which is kind of equivalent to what we learned about earlier about the probability of the situation happening at all. This normalizing constant is basically a sum of probabilities that the particular data that we have will be produced given any hypothesis for the object's location, like anything, any hypothesis for the object location, not just the most likely hypothesis that we're calculating the likelihood, or the probability of. And yeah, so the end result of all of this is going to be something called a posterior probability distribution. And this will give you a distribution of probabilities that the object is in a given location. And from this, you can take the highest probability and then you'll see that that orientation in degrees is where the sound is coming from. So now a more brain-specific model is something called a Wilson Cowan model. The simplest sort of type of Wilson Cowan model is one that has two populations of neurons, one being excitatory and one being inhibitory. But we aren't really interested in the individual firing patterns of the neurons in this kind of model. For a Wilson Cowan model, what we're really interested in is the average firing rate produced by the entire neural ensemble. So the math that describes the dynamics of the excitatory and inhibitory populations' firing rates is shown here through two differential equations, which might look scary at first, but I'll walk you through them, and they aren't actually, they're more straightforward than you might expect. So what's happening is that this function, R sub E of t, is kind of the average, is kind of the average firing rate of the excitatory population at any time t. And while this one is the average firing rate of the inhibitory population at a time t. So, and then tau, I forgot to put the subscripts here, but tau sub e should be here, and tau sub I control the time scales that we're tracking changes in average firing rate over for the excitatory and inhibitory populations, respectively. There are also connection strengths represented with omega. And so like omega sub E is the connection strength from excitatory to excitatory, while omega sub EI is the connection strength from inhibitory to excitatory, and so on. Over here it's excitatory to inhibitory, and over here it's the connection strength from inhibitory to inhibitory. And then it represents the external input into this system. So, so basically, and this can plot the relationship between the inputs to the population and the output firing rate, also known as the transfer functions, for both of these populations. So now, if you plot the average firing rate of the inhibitory population as a function of time versus the average firing rate of the excitatory population over time, if you plot R sub I over R sub E, you actually get this thing called a phase plane, where you can kind of see how both of these populations will evolve over time. And here you can see, for example, like just an example plot of like plotting the sort of like dynamics of the inhibitory population over the sort of dynamics of the excitatory population. And now what you're trying to find is where this sort of system will want to go based on the inputs, right? So what you need to do in order to find that, in order to kind of like find where the system will want to go, is you have to plot in this space the set of points that show when the activity of each of the populations is not changing. And this line is called a nullcline. And so here you can see the nullcline for, I just gave an example, a nullcline for an excitatory population and a nullcline for an inhibitory population. So along the nullcline for the excitatory population, the change in the excitatory population's average firing rate over time is 0. Not the actual average firing rate, but just the change in it over time. And it's the same for the inhibitory population, where along this nullcline, the change in average firing rate is going to be 0. And what we find is actually that the system wants to move towards points where both the excitatory and the inhibitory average firing rates are constant and unchanging. And those are the intersection points of these two nullclines. However, now some of these points are more stable than others, and the system will only want to move towards stable points. But evaluating that stability does involve some linear algebra and eigenvalue calculations, which I won't get into in this class, but like shoot me an email if you want to know how that works, and I'll be happy to explain it to you. But for now, just understand that the outputs of the Wilson Cowan model kind of want to move towards and will update the model based on these stable intersection points where both excitatory and inhibitory populations' average firing rates are unchanging. All right, finally, now I'd like to talk about deep learning and neural networks. So deep learning has a few advantages over other types of machine learning for specific types of neural data that need to have like many dimensions. And by that I mean, like, for example, a 20,000 dimensional vector representing the responses from like 20,000 neurons in a mouse's primary visual cortex. Yeah, given a stimulus orientation. And like, I know some of you in the class probably know a lot more about deep learning than I do, so, but I'm just going to give a basic overview. So to decode the orientation of an object based on the neural responses in primary visual cortex, for example, we can build something like this, where there are all of these individual neurons, and each one provides inputs to these guys in this hidden layer vector created by this formula up here. And for the purposes of the demonstration, I'm just putting in one hidden layer, but a characteristic feature of deep neural networks is having multiple of these hidden layers and kind of more depth, which is, deep learning. So over here, N just describes N just describes like the number of neurons, while M describes the number of like nodes in the hidden layer. Over here, this lowercase n is just kind of like to the nth stimulus that has been presented. And here, this W term is a weight matrix, and this is kind of the dimensionality of that weight matrix. And the weight matrix is what determines the strength of determines the strength of like these kind of connections. This one is like the input, the weight in connection matrix strength, but while there would be another weight term over here for the outward going ones from the hidden layer. And B is just like another kind of bias or weight term. And yeah, so since all of these neurons might respond very differently to the stimulus, it's very complex and needs to be deciphered with something called an activation function represented by phi, which will be nonlinear and kind of multiplied with the rest of this. And without the activation function, and with only like a linear kind of transformation, what we're really doing is just creating a weighted sum of elements in the input, and the hidden layer isn't really changing anything. And so we need this activation function here to actually get the network to be more expressive. And so there are like different types of activation functions. For example, there are like sigmoidal ones, but the one that's most commonly used is something called ReLU. And this is the function here, where basically it's x if x is greater than 0, but it's 0 if anything else. So most deep neural networks will like here, most deep neural networks will ultimately result in kind of a vector of outputs, which while being trained, the network will then evaluate by taking the sort of sum of the squares of the differences between what the response should be for each neuron and the response it actually outputs. And this is kind of like the cost. And if the resulting cost is small, then the network is doing pretty well in predicting the, in our case, actual orientation of the stimulus. But if the cost is large, it's not doing so well. So taking the average cost across lots and lots of training examples gives you a decent indicator of how the network is performing. Now, if you, we want to minimize the cost though, right? So if we want to kind of minimize the cost, we can think of it, since it has like this huge dimensionality, it's kind of nice to visualize it as kind of this like surface almost, that we're trying to get to like the bottommost parts of. So the way the network actually updates itself is kind of by judging the inputs it's getting in a way that will try to minimize this cost function by kind of taking almost like the slope of the cost function over a finite amount of points and seeing if it's positive or negative, and consequently knowing how to update the weight and the bias parameters for the neuron so that the next time around the cost would be closer to the minimum value. And so obviously, since the cost function might be super like wavy and complicated, this might not result in the network finding like just the absolute minimum, but also like these like local minima. And also increasing the number of elements in the hidden layer will increase the size of the neural network, and through that you also run the risk of making a neural network that's super good at deciphering the set of data that it's trained on, but then it performs very poorly on new test data because kind of what happened was it took all of the noise in the training data set and wasn't able to properly evaluate what was noise and what was actual signal in a process called overfitting. And so another thing is like if you add more hidden layers and increasing the depth of the thing, it also runs the risk of overfitting and needs a lot more data. But like whatever the task at hand is or whatever you're trying to simulate, you need to figure these things out in order to get the most optimal results. So yeah, just like as a final thought, while trying to simulate the brain as a whole, just as a mental exercise, I would kind of personally encourage you to think not like simply of replicating everything exactly, but looking at the various systems and circuits and cellular and synaptic properties that we've learned about throughout the semester and kind of try and like puzzle piece together how they all work. For example, like the basal ganglia might be optimally modeled through a Wilson Cowan model because the important output of each neural ensemble in the basal ganglia is really its average firing rate of all of the neurons like within each neural ensemble. But with like visual cortex, you know, deep learning is better to simulate it, and maybe parts of medial prefrontal cortex can get by with a Bayesian model, etc. So like, you know, the brain is this complicated and beautiful machine that has various parts and systems on various scales that have unique properties. And so I personally don't think we need the dimensionality of like the nearly 100 trillion synapses to model the entire brain, and kind of that also that like simulating every last synapse without taking into account the properties of the circuits that hold them, and critically evaluating whether every last synapse or even every last neuron is necessary to model it would almost be like dishonoring this like tapestry of different information processing methods and algorithms that is actually, you know, contained within our skulls. But yeah, I'm excited to discuss the science fiction stories with all of you. I think they're highly relevant to not just what we learned in this, but also from material throughout the semester. And the final is due next week, and it's the same prompt as the midterm, where you demonstrate your understanding of your favorite course material from either the second half of the semester or the semester as a whole, to the level where I've been teaching it in whatever way you want. And it can be like songs, paintings, poems, code, PowerPoint presentations, anything. Just make sure you'll be able to present it in class or email me if you have time zone difficulties. And these were the references I used. Neuromatch Academy actually has a bunch of like tutorials and things like that available for free. And this lecture series is also really good for to build an intuitive understanding of like neural networks. And of course, these two classes were super useful to me for this lecture. All right, thank you, and see you soon.